Mainstreaming extremism, social media's role in radicalizing America. And due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, am I on? Okay. Emergency. Today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conference. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise, which I'm often guilty of. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphone each time that you wish to speak. Additionally, members will need to be visible on the screen in order to be recognized. If we don't see you, if you're not there, then you will not be able to be called upon. Documents for the record can be sent to Chloe Rodriguez at the email address that we've provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. So now member open statements will be held, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. So good morning, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today for a virtual hearing on social media's role in spreading extremism. Throughout our nation's history, we have seen extremism undermine public faith in our institutions, incite violence, sow division, and spread hate speech. Whether it be the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis or bullying of vulnerable individuals, these attacks are not new to Americans. But what is different today is the way that social media algorithms can amplify hate speech. Despite the many conveniences and benefits for communication, over time, social media's dark side has grown and divided Americans at a time when we really need to pull together. As big tech developed the online ecosystem and monetized its functions to their enormous benefit, these companies have done little really to protect Americans from the dangers that are lurking in the dark corners. Driven by profit and power, and in the face of obvious harm, these mega companies successfully have convinced governments all over the world to essentially leave them alone, lest we disturb the delicate garden that they are tending. Big tech has helped divide nations and has stoked genocide in others. In our nation, and stoked genocide. Consider Myanmar, where we saw mass murder of the Rohingya people. And these companies have profited at every turn. Consider the QAnon conspiracy theory that has thrived online for years now. Q followers believe that the entire world is controlled by a secret cabal of child abusers who will eventually drink the blood of victims. The FBI has linked the group to domestic terror and considers it a continuing terrorism threat. I would like to commend our colleagues, Adam Kinzinger, Tom Alanowski, and Denver Riggleman for confronting this threat head on. There is no doubt that that controversy and extremism drives engagement and therefore profit. Algorithms that amplify extremist views, also amplify profit for these platforms. A 9/11 conspiracy video has been seen 22 million times on Facebook in the last week. Each view keeps eyeballs on the platform and dollars rolling in. Nowhere has Facebook been more negligent than in its oversight of its group function. Facebook groups promoting misogyny have grown by 10%, and anti-LGBT groups have grown by 22%, and groups promoting anti-Semitism have grown by 27% in the last week. In a recent interview with an engineer at Facebook, he said that the group recommendation algorithm is, quote, the scariest feature of the platform, the darkest manifestation. And then he went on further to say, a user entering one of the groups and Facebook essentially pigeonholes them into a lifestyle they can never really get out of, unquote. I wanted to let you know that next week, I will be circulating a draft legislative proposal that aims to fundamentally alter these companies' business models and give consumers and regulators the recourse when these companies fail in their basic commitments, in their stated basic commitments to consumers. And I certainly hope all of you will take a close look at that. I want to, at this point, thank the witnesses for their testimony and recognize for 5 minutes the ranking member, Kathy Rogers, and you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our hearing focused on social media. As with any disruptive technology, the internet certainly has its faults, especially when platforms are used to cause real harm, especially if companies are not fulfilling their responsibilities. However, I hope we all recognize how the internet is still an overwhelming force for good, especially in these challenging times. It gives Americans a platform for their voices to be heard. It keeps us connected to our loved ones. It offers unprecedented access to information and unlimited opportunities for innovation. So I appreciate our witnesses for being here today to share how we can all strive for a better and safer internet for all. Freedom of speech is central to American democracy. It's what sets us apart from nearly every other nation on earth. And yet this bedrock principle is increasingly under attack. Free speech is not absolute, and there are certainly exceptions, like when it comes to physically harming others or oneself. However, I am extremely concerned when platforms apply inconsistent content moderating policies for their own purposes, whether as an excuse to take responsibility for failing to enforce content standards fairly, or by altering speech to settle scores with political or competitive opponents. There's no clearer example of a platform using its power for political purposes than Twitter, singling out President Trump, while also leaving blatant threats of violence by activists, Democratic candidates, and authoritarian foreign leaders untouched. Twitter's rules say that they are intended to ensure all people can participate in public conversation freely and safely, but that's not what we are seeing. To further its leadership's political agenda, Twitter has instead embraced an inconsistent application of its own standards. For political speech we disagree with, the answer should not be censorship. The answer should always be more speech. And for harmful speech, it should be removed, regardless of the political leanings of the speaker or the moderator. Sadly, Twitter has fallen well short in encouraging healthy discourse online. For example, the following are blue checkmark tweets and accounts that exist on Twitter today. Unlike President Trump, they haven't been fact-checked or tagged for violation of standards by @Jack. The World Health Organization shared this propaganda from the CCP. Quote, preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel #coronavirus. That's false. Another example is a well-known online activist of the left who has repeatedly doxed and falsely accused innocent people of heinous crimes, like falsely accusing a Texas state trooper of rape. He also accused an innocent man of murdering a 7-year-old girl. Death threats were also sent to the man's family, and he ultimately took his own life. This online activist also used Twitter to threaten the lives of innocent police officers in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Twitter said this didn't violate their standards. This tweet is word for word from a candidate challenging Republican Congressman Brian Mast. She tweeted, I quote, "Is that really the new rule we want? Killing is okay if it's a bad guy? It's now open season on Trump, Barr, Kavanaugh, Pompeo," end quote. Can you imagine if the president or any Republican said that about Democrats? My only hope is that the Secret Service took this threat more seriously than Jack. These are only a few examples of blatant hypocrisy by Twitter. Bottom line, Twitter continues to tag the president's tweets with increased frequency as we approach the election. But they've ignored violent threats against Republicans, allowed for propaganda pushed by the Chinese Communist Party, tolerated doxing, and the incitement of violence against police officers, and also left clear threats by the supreme leader of Iran go unchallenged. This doesn't add up, and it doesn't build trust in the fair enforcement of Twitter's content standards. It begs the question, what's the point of their terms of service and content policies if Jack is intentionally applying them differently depending upon who the user is? Is Twitter a fair and safe platform for free speech and the battle of ideas? Or a platform where content bias is acceptable as long as it influences the election in favor of the political whims of the woke mob? If the majority is truly concerned about platforms having an effect on the upcoming election, I hope that you will join me in demanding accountability from this platform that is blatantly putting its thumb on the scale for one side over the other. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and now the chair of the full committee is recognized, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Schakowsky. Extremists who sow chaos and division, incite violence, and impose their radical beliefs and ideologies remain an ever-present threat to our welfare society and way of life in the U.S., and the magnitude of that threat has become painfully clear in recent years. 11 worshipers massacred in a rampage at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, more than 46 shoppers killed or injured in a mass shooting targeting so-called Mexicans at a shopping center in El Paso, 9 black worshipers murdered by a white supremacist during a Bible study in Charleston, 2 killed and wounded by a vigilante shooter in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Extremists are even exploiting COVID-19 to divide our nation in the time of crisis. According to the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, in March, a New Jersey white supremacist group altered its propaganda and social media posts to falsely claim that immigration and Jewish people are behind the pandemic. Their members have since attended anti-lockdown events to push these egregiously false claims. So there's just a lot of anger and resentment across this country. Only last night we saw pleas for justice in the Breonna Taylor case left unanswered by the judicial system, and this led to violence in the streets, including the shooting of 2 police officers. And such violence is obviously unacceptable. We have to work to promote civility and unity. The right to peacefully assemble and seek redress from the government is a constitutional right, but I fear that extremists online and in the streets are taking advantage of these turbulent times to divide our nation and threaten its people. Acts of violence, disruption, and misinformation represent a troubling trend of increasing extremist activity across the country. 4 of the 6 most deadly years for domestic extremist killings have occurred since 2015, and experts warn that current political and social polarization, coupled with increasing economic disparity, are ideal conditions for even further increases in extremism. Now, while extremism is not new, methods for indoctrination, radicalizing, and mobilizing individuals have evolved over the past decade. The internet, an efficient tool for the dissemination of hate and radical ideologies traditionally left in the fringes of society, has become the predominant incubator for extremism. And social media platforms have served as the predominant outlet for bigotry, conspiracy theories, and incitements to violence. Social media companies represent their platforms as forms for connecting people, but the ability to connect like-minded people and susceptible individuals is being exploited by extremists to recruit and radicalize Americans. Now, we have seen too many stories of young people, many of whom are socially and physically isolated, who found a sense of belonging with people who turn out to be members of a hate group. They get lured by gradually more extreme content and then risk the threat of losing these new social connections if they do not conform. And conforming too often includes taking part in acts of hatred, intimidation, and even violence. This is deeply concerning, and this activity is magnified by social media's business model, which only makes the problem worse. The primary goal of social media platforms is gaining more active users. Their profitability depends on growth and engagement, more eyes on their pages for longer periods of time to more advertising dollars, and as research has shown, lies, outrage, and novelty are more engaging than neutral, bland content. It's not that employees at these companies make a conscious choice to allow this hateful content, but their algorithms are programmed to optimize growth and engagement, often without consideration of the content that achieves it. And these algorithms don't just let harmful content exist on the platform, they actually amplify it. The deluge of harmful content drowns out counter messaging, content that could correct misinformation and discredit the ideologies and actions of violent extremists. Because people are already overwhelmed, it's clear that this bad speech cannot be connected solely with more speech. Rather than acknowledge and tackle the root of the problems, social media companies address only the public relations aspect. They rely heavily on user reporting to address extremist content, allowing disinformation and inciting content to be viewed thousands of times before it's flogged or removed. What's more, there's no doubt that some political figures are fanning the flames of extremism. This toxic political rancor is contributing to the rise of right-wing extremism in particular, which has become the greatest terrorist threat facing our nation today. The majority of all terrorist incidents in the U.S. since 1994 were committed by right-wing extremists. So we've had several hearings over the past few years trying to shine light on these problems and imploring social media companies to act. It's clear they don't want to do it on their own. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about their experiences and their ideas for how Congress can make a difference. I have no doubt, Madam Chair, that we have to act. This is not going to correct itself on its own. So thank you for having the hearing, and I yield back to the chairwoman.
The gentleman yields back, and now it is my pleasure to recognize Mr. Walden, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, good morning, Madam Chair and Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. I really want to welcome our witnesses to learn your perspectives and hear your experience. My colleagues have heard me say a few times over the years I've been on the committee, I have a degree in journalism, was in the radio business for more than 2 decades, and I think it's given me an important perspective on free speech and our liberties as guaranteed under. It's also provided important perspectives on the responsibilities that platforms have to ensure voices can be heard. I've said before, it feels like social media is really become a cancer on civility. And I think all sides could probably agree on that. The challenge is, what do we do about it while protecting our First Amendment rights? You can learn a lot from history. In fact, if you think back to radio, 1938, Orson Welles had that radio program that inspired panic and dramatizing a Martian invasion with an adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds. Despite notices that it was fiction, people still believed it was real at the time, and it set off a furor. Unfortunately, in today's social media age, furor set off by misinformation has become all too common. It spreads more quickly and further, and it's often harder to recognize. In fact, this year, following the tragic death, the murder of George Floyd in May, Washington, D.C. experienced its own strange occurrence online. With no disclosure, it was fictional content. Under a hashtag at DC Blackout that went viral on Twitter, claims were made that the internet service had gone down despite no legitimate news sources corroborating that information. That viral campaign went unfettered on Twitter for hours and spread to platforms. To quote the Washington Post, the thread sold with untrue claims that authorities had somehow blocked protesters from communicating from their smartphones to crack down on the unrest, which included looting and some fires, close quote. The tweets included images of Washington burning. Images we would learn later were from a television show, not from real life. During the incident, we now know there were fake and hijacked accounts involved with the misinformation campaign around the events in Washington. And despite its ability to quickly spot trends for its own promotional purposes, as well as suspect activity in account, it concerns me that Twitter is not able to quickly spot this misinformation platform. People of every ethnicity, age, gender, and religion are harmed when these events escalate and bad actors look to turn peaceful protests into violent riots. The platforms must do more. They must do better and force their users to share publicly how they plan to do that. In fact, Chairman Pallone, Chairwoman Schakowsky, Subcommittee Republican Leader Rogers, and I wanted the CEOs of these companies to be here today. It's not the first time we've requested they appear, and it's always helpful and appropriate when the leaders of these amazingly successful American companies come before congressional committees and explain their practices, which they did over 3 years ago while I was chairman of the committee. Some have been willing to appear, but others like Google have yet to do so. Users of their service deserve answers, like Ms. Dumpson, who should feel safe to study at a place of her choosing. Police officers like Mr. Donahue, who has to worry about his brothers and sisters in uniform being targets of vicious violence. I hope to be more enlightened from the questions and debate that we have here today. I also want to share my disappointment that the majority's memo for today's hearing did not include ambush-style killings of law enforcement officers as a form of mainstreaming of extremism. Let me be clear. Extremism that results in violence is wrong. And that includes the terrible ambush-style killings of law enforcement officials. The Democrats' memo stated that from 1994 to 2020, a quarter of terrorist incidents and 22 deaths were committed by left-wing extremists who opposed capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism or supported decentralized political systems such as anarchism. That number should, sadly, be a lot higher, but the memo looked the other way when it came to ambush-style killings of law enforcement officials. You have to ask why. Think about how that must make their families feel. Our great country's had a rough time in 2020, and I think we'll all be glad to put this year in the rearview mirror. But along the way, I hope we've realized how modern tools of communication can easily be misused, abused, should I say, and how important it is that we all work together to both protect free speech without ripping the fabric of the country and to protect the safety and well-being of online users. Hopefully the platforms will rise to the challenge and do more voluntarily. Otherwise, Congress will have to step in to this fray. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. And now I would like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Mark Ginsburg is president of the Coalition for a Safer Web. Taylor Dumpson. She is a hate crime survivor and cyber harassment target. I want to thank her for her personal testimony. John John Donahue is a fellow at Rutgers University Myler Center for Community Protection and Resilience, and former chief of strategy initiatives at the New York City Police Department. And finally, Tom Kendall, who is chief executive officer of Moment. So we want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony, and we will begin with Mr. Ginsburg, and you have 5 minutes for your opening statement, for your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chairman. And to all members of the committee, thank you for having me. Believe me, whatever may be your political persuasion, I share your pain. The Coalition for a Safer Web is a relatively new nonpartisan nonprofit organization, and our mission is to promote new technological and policy initiatives to protect Americans against the threat of internet-based radicalization and extremist violence. I want to particularly recognize my Vice President, Eric Feinberg, who has done so much to help further the mission of our organization. As was stated by all the members, a poisonous brew of extremist groups from both fringes of the political spectrum, both here and abroad, have succeeded in hijacking and gaming social media platforms to radicalize Americans. The best evidence is the increase in arrests by the FBI and local authorities of radicalized domestic terrorists attracted to neo-Nazi ideology, so-called Antifa ideology, radical Islamic groups, anarchists, etc., as we have seen constantly in the cities that have been under siege, including Portland. And this has only gotten worse since the pandemic and the terrible events in Charlottesville. The threat is so acute that the FBI considers domestic extremist groups the first-tier threat. Because the business model of major social media companies is dependent on digital revenue, there is no financial or legal incentive to independently enable oversight or vigorous accountability denied as long as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act provides a shield to these platforms. Major social media companies, and I'm referring to Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter, are consistently breaking their pledges to do better to protect Americans from extremist content. Meanwhile, radical groups trolling for converts have revised ingenious methods to evade detection, assisted by extremists supporting web communications and hosting channels, many operating with European-based and Russian government support. I want to now turn to YouTube. YouTube's management has evaded congressional immediate scrutiny as it hides behind its parent, Alphabet and Google. It's a puzzle to me, since YouTube stands out in the radical hit parade as one of the worst purveyors of extremism, and I'd like to give you an example that really has set us off. It has ignored repeated demands that I myself have communicated to its CEO, Susan Wojcicki, to remove, listen to this, tens of thousands of videos instructing would-be terrorists how to construct terrorist weapons, including pipe bombs. Pipe bombs that were used by the Boston Marathon bombers, pipe bombs that were in the knapsack of the man who committed the shooting at Parkland High School. And the list goes on and on. In addition, YouTube hosts uploaded virulent video games inviting young users to target Jews and blacks. For young Americans, YouTube has become a veritable black hole of digital shark bait to radicalize and train users to fall prey to social media's amplification algorithm rabbit holes. I'd like to now say a few words about Facebook. Time and again, Facebook has assured Congress and the public it has permanently removed extremist content deemed a violation of its ever-shifting terms of service. But we at our organization continue to find it. Exhibit A is the live stream Christchurch video, which Facebook's executives have said time and again, it is permanently deplatformed. Of the 15 Christchurch videos that we in our organization have located on Facebook and Instagram since January 20th, 13 remain. Others using language accounts, including Arabic, Russian, and even Yiddish. Moreover, Facebook's artificial intelligence flagged these videos as graphic violence, sort of giving it an R rating, enabling them to remain. Really? Is that the way Mr. Zuckerberg permanently deplatforms such content that he has promised to do? We have assessed that Facebook's AI is simply untrained to detect previously deplatformed content tied to non-English speaking account. 4 people in our organization are able to find what legions of Facebook engineers are unable to do so. Moreover, Facebook has failed to take down QAnon accounts, which we revealed in a recent report and also amplified by an investigation by the New York Times just a few days ago. I think that there's a reason why Facebook refuses to take the action necessary. First, if it adopted the type of technology that we recommend, it would require it to disclose the gap between its pledge and performance by letting individuals such as ours to access its API. And it's not prepared to let third-party technology innovators to access API. I want to close by saying a word about Telegram. Telegram is a platform of encrypted communications that has become, in effect, the most important purveyor of extremist radicalization, linking transnational extremist groups between Europe and the United States. Telegram's Dubai-based management is culpable for enabling the spreading of the QAnon conspiracy and neo-Nazi and radicalization back to the United States using Russian government trolls. We hope that Congress will join our call to action to urge our ally, the United Arab Emirates, as well as both Apple and Google, to, in effect, deplatform Telegram. And I'll have more to say about that in our questions. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I do want to encourage the witnesses to stick to the 5-minute timeline. And Ms. Dumpson, it is yours for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Pallone, Chairwoman Schakowsky, Ranking Member Walden, and Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, and members of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce. Thank you for the opportunity to share my personal experience and perspective about the role of social media companies in radicalizing America and perpetuating extremism and hate on their platforms. Unfortunately, I know firsthand that online hate ruins lives by stoking fear, silencing voices, and causing harm to people's physical and professional safety, all of which have a serious, lasting effect on victims and their families. And just because it happens digitally does not mean it should be taken less seriously. Hate should never be normalized. Nigger agitator, nigress, and she-boon were just a few of the words used by Andrew Anglin, known white supremacist, founder of the neo-Nazi website The Daily Stormer, and co-organizer of Charlottesville's Unite the Right rally, to describe me after I became the first Black woman to hold the position of student government president at the American University in May 2017. On May 1st, 2017, the day after I was sworn in as president, a masked perpetrator hung bananas from black corded nooses from light posts and bus stops around my campus, as you can see in this picture right here. The bananas were labeled with AKA and AKA free, making reference to that predominantly Black sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, of which I am a member, and made reference to Harambe Bait, referencing the gorilla that was killed at the Cincinnati Zoo in 2016. As this vile act gained national attention and was investigated by the Department of Justice as a hate crime, my story must have come to Andrew Anglin's attention. By May 4th, 2017, Anglin had taken it upon himself to incite a coordinated cyber harassment campaign to encourage his followers to, quote, send me some words of support, end quote, and by doxing and providing his followers with direct links to my Facebook and Twitter pages. In other words, Anglin and his followers posted my personal information online with the intent for the information to be used to harass, stalk, and threaten me, and to be used against me for an unlawful purpose. Due to his notoriety amongst those in the white supremacist community, Anglin's followers heeded his call to action. Since Anglin's troll storm, some of the threatening, racist, and sexist comments directed at me on social media platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter include, but are not limited to, quote, I'll take a few years for painting the street with her blood. Quote, I wish I knew her address. I would send her a noose so she can go hang herself and do the world a favor. Quote, I think I'd take my chances with hiding her small tit body after her fatal accident. Quote, just smash her in the head with a bike lock hard enough to split her head open with a wound that needed stitches. I seen you only get probation for that offense. There are more statements similar to those and can be seen in my written testimony. As a result of this experience, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression, and lost 15% of my body weight. I also experienced flashbacks and triggers and am forced to take increased measures to protect myself and my family. Most importantly, the harassment that England incited on various social media platforms continues to this day, despite England's troll storm being initiated over 3 years ago. I am now used to reviewing, filtering, identifying, screenshotting, and saving multiple threatening and harassing comments on a monthly basis in the event that the comments rise to the level of a true threat, specifying time, place, and manner of attack. But I should not have to be. This is why I sued England, the Daily Stormer's parent company, and 2 other defendants in federal court for violating the District of Columbia's Human Rights Act, which prohibits individuals from interfering with someone's use of a public accommodation, with pro bono representation by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the Washington Lawyers Committee, and Kirkland & Ellis, LLP. In Dumpson versus Aid, Judge Rosemary Collier set precedent by ruling that online racist and gender-based harassment can interfere with an individual's equal access to a place of public accommodations, as I had to make significant changes to how I navigated on a day-to-day basis, both on and off campus. Weeks ago, Facebook was yet again apathetic to racism and incitement to violence, and the call to arms event that resulted in the Kenosha shooting was flagged over 450 times, but once again, Facebook did nothing. Unfortunately, this does not surprise me because out of the hundreds of times that I have reported the hate directed at me on Facebook and other platforms, the social media companies have never contacted me despite it being brought to their attention. I speak from experience when I say that when online social media companies are left to regulate themselves, instances of hate, bigotry, and prejudice run rampant under the guise of free speech. Today, extremists are using the internet for the purposes of recruiting, organizing, and mobilizing members of their digital community to commit threatening acts online and in person. In 2017, H.R. 3067, the Online Safety Modernization Act, was introduced, which would have provided federal protections against doxing and swatting. However, it was not signed into law. This is why I'm a big supporter of initiatives like ADL's Backspace Hate and the Stop Hate for Profit campaign to raise awareness and combat harmful online activities, including cyber harassment, swatting, and doxing. But civil rights activists and organizations cannot do this work alone. Congress must act. In my written remarks, I offer 6 ways that Congress can act to address the rise in hate crimes, both online and in person, in partnership with the ADL. And I look forward to discussing some of these recommendations in the question and answer portion of this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your personal testimony, and I want to recognize Mr. Donahue for 5 minutes for his testimony.
Thank you, Chair Schakowsky. I'm pleased to testify today about the serious public safety concerns and specifically challenges to law enforcement raised by the growing phenomenon of cybersocial extremism and its power to influence violent action domestically. The challenge has both strategic and tactical considerations for law enforcement, which I will discuss in more detail. To begin, we know that social media, the use of it for promoting ideas and opinions and encouraging participation in civic discourse is well documented. The platforms are mobile and ubiquitous, and platforms want participation. They've become astonishingly effective in capturing and leveraging human behavioral data right down to the individual. Here in the U.S., where we cherish constitutional rights to free speech and peaceable assembly, social media has been embraced to share ideas and opinions on any topic at any time. But what is recently observable from open source social media data is that there is an exponential growth in participation around revolutionary and extremist themes across the ideological spectrum. But why is that a problem? said, heard it a little bit earlier. The earliest stages of the ISIS caliphate, social media was used to effectively motivate some youth to take up arms in support of that designated foreign terrorist organization right here in America. Recruitment started on the surface web and gradually moved to encrypted communications to shield criminal conversations from law enforcement. I saw what happens with extremist ideology and what it can do on the streets of New York. And that same cycle is happening domestically with movements on the far right and the far left. A report I co-authored earlier this year with my colleagues from the Network Contagion Research Institute shows how on social media, memes become viral, evolve, permitting extremists to plant hateful and revolutionary ideas right in the public eye, often disguised as jokes or code words for those in the know. You've heard about the Boogaloo, the far-right militia movement. In protests over pandemic lockdown, Boogaloo people played out their inside jokes by wearing Hawaiian shirts and carrying semi-automatic weapons at protests in the center of major American cities. And memes shared on Boogaloo message boards gamified assaults on law enforcement, encouraging violence through jargon known in the video gaming community. And while it appears that the online militia sphere is inhabited exclusively by the far-right extremists, they are not by any means alone. In a report released this month, my colleagues in the NCRI quantified that online violent, anarchic, and other far less social media spaces saw exponential growth, upwards of 1,000% during the most recent period of unrest in America. These anti-government, anti-police messages broke into the mainstream, including Facebook and Twitter, where they have their greatest reach. Encouragement of violence, designs for ghost guns, dehumanizing opponents, advocating physical attacks on law enforcement and elected officials, and sharing tactical countermeasures to legitimate governmental activity to control riotous criminal behaviors. All of these and topics and more are shared on public forums and pushed to people's smartphones. These may be original ideas, and they don't have to, they may be original ideas and thoughts, but they don't propagate themselves. It's the algorithms that drive profit for social media companies that push that information into people's social media feeds. That's the strategic challenge. What extremist thoughts and ideologies are pulsing through the internet and social media, and who should understand how such ideologies are evolving? What's apparent is that regardless of the ideology, criminal behavior during recent civil unrest were motivated in part by what's happening online. That's the tactical issue. For example, protest activity is constitutional and police are sworn to protect it. It's the criminal activity that's at issue for the civil society and police. And intelligence gathering brings its own tensions and limitations. Law enforcement needs information to prepare for the safety of all at these events. That's smart government, and safeguards are in place to prevent overreach. Frankly, much of what law enforcement needs comes from open source, but social media companies have unilaterally limited when, how, and what they will share. And particularly when they're trying to address life safety issues, social media companies continually stymie public safety. Law enforcement has a tough time when policing at the best of times. So what can be done? Despite social media companies' efforts to minimize the availability of extremist messages, like we just heard, the self-imposed standards are ad hoc and more likely to resemble a game of whack-a-mole. And to be certain, social media companies are not in a position to identify those who will mobilize to violence. Law enforcement is and must remain vigilant to identify and act beforehand, but the timeframes are remarkably short. We know before the murderous attack at the Trio Light Synagogue in Pittsburgh in October of 2018, the murderer said on a website, "I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in." While law enforcement is the last line of defense against extremists who mobilize to violence, it is ironic that they've become the ultimate target. The outcomes of extremist movements are not predictable, and the time for acknowledging social media platforms' culpability in this phenomenon and rapidly working to preserve civil society is upon us. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you. And now, Mr. Kendall, it is your time for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairpersons Pallone and Chairperson Chakowski and Ranking Members Walden and Rogers for inviting me to speak today. When I started working in technology, my hope was to build products that brought people together in new and productive ways. I wanted to improve the world that we all lived in. Instead, social media services that I and others have built have torn people apart with alarming speed and intensity. At the very least, we have eroded our collective understanding as a country. At worst, I fear we are pushing ourselves to the brink of civil war. I feel shamed by this outcome, and I am deeply concerned by it. So I'm compelled to talk to you all about what we can do to further limit the damage and maybe even undo some of it. My path in technology started at Facebook, where I was the first director of Modernization. I was later the president of Pinterest for 5 years, and since leaving 3 years ago, I've been the CEO of Moment, which is a technology company focused on reversing many of the troubling outcomes created by social media. At Facebook, I believe we sought to mine as much human attention as possible and turned it into historically unprecedented profits. To do this, we didn't simply create something useful and fun. We took a page from Big Tobacco's playbook, working to make our offering addictive at the outset. Tobacco companies initially just sought to make nicotine more potent, but eventually that wasn't enough to grow the business as fast as they hoped. So they added sugar and menthol to cigarettes so users could hold the smoke in their lungs for longer periods. At Facebook, a simple directory of people engaged millions of users and kept them returning to the service almost every day. But business realities necessitated that we make the service even more engaging. So we added updates, photo tagging, and likes, which made status and reputation primary and laid the groundwork for the growing mental health issues we see resulting from these services. I left the company in 2010, but I continued to watch the company evolve and see the outcomes unfold. The next page in Big Tobacco's playbook was to add bronchodilators to cigarettes. This allowed the smoke to get in contact with more surface area of the lungs, allowing for misinformation, conspiracy theories, and fake news to flourish were Facebook's bronchodilators. But that incendiary content wasn't enough. Tobacco companies then added ammonia to cigarettes to increase the speed with which nicotine traveled to the brain. Facebook's ability to deliver this incendiary content to the right person at the right time in the exact right way through their algorithms, that is their ammonia. And we now know it fosters tribalism and division. Social media preys on the most primal parts of your brain. It provokes, it shocks, and it enrages. With misinformation, these companies hide behind the First Amendment and assert that they stand for free speech. But the algorithms continually choose which voices each of us actually hear. I don't think it's free speech that these companies revere. Instead, Facebook and their cohorts worship at the altar of engagement and cast other concerns aside, raising the voices of division, anger, hate, and misinformation to drown out the voices of truth, justice, morality, and peace. On a personal level, I'm aware that I've benefited from these addictive business models, and this deepens my sense of responsibility for where we are and my sense of obligation to help us improve things. I don't believe that I could have known at the time where the work I contributed to would lead, but for my role, I do bear responsibility, and accordingly, I'm dedicating my time and resources to undo as much damage as I can. I don't believe social media is the root cause of every problem we're facing, but I believe it may be the most powerful accelerant in history. I'm not a lawyer or legislator, but I can't imagine where we'd be if we hadn't held tobacco companies accountable for making so many people sick. And yet, this is what we've allowed social media companies to do, and I believe it has to change. These services are making us sick. These services divide us. It's time we take account of the damage. And it's time we put in place the necessary measures to protect ourselves and our country.
The gentleman yields back, and that we now have concluded witness opening statements. At this time, we will move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses, and I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. The title of the hearing is Mainstreaming Extremism. How did we get here, and how can we fix it? To answer those questions, we need to take a deep look at online platforms, which are an increasingly great part of our daily lives. Mr. Kendall, while you were with Facebook and Pinterest, did people within the company discuss the potential harms that a new product or feature could pose to users or to society? Were there times that the company chose to release the product or feature designed despite the potential harm that it could cause?
This was primarily an issue at Facebook, much less of an issue at Pinterest. I would say at Facebook, the primary discussion around harm was revolved around privacy, right? User privacy, and we raised concerns about that in many instances of new product releases. I would say the MO of the company was that oftentimes those concerns were ignored. What superseded that was a view that, look, more features that connect more people is good for the network and good for the world.
Well, let me ask you another question on that line. I assume that Facebook considered legal liability risks when deciding how and whether to launch a new product. In your experience, was a product's ability to facilitate extremism, racism, or violence considered in that legal risk assessment?
It was considered, but then heavily discounted. I think that the timeline of the FTC imposing threats against Facebook and then those being ignored for years and years and years and years until really last year when there was a $5 billion fine, I think highlights the pattern, which is that they don't respond to constraints, they don't respond to threats. Where they appear to respond, and I think privacy is a good path to look at, is when there are real economic costs to the business.
See, thank you. Ms. Dumpson, I just want to thank you for the personal testimony and the personal pain that it must bring you even today to repeat that. I want to see if you could tell a little more about what the online attacks meant for your life. And in your written testimony, you talk about how it changed the changes that you have had to make. I wonder, how did you deal with going to classes and to participate in normal activities, or didn't you?
Thank you, Congresswoman. When the hate crime initially happened in May 2017, it happened during finals week. So I missed my final exams. I was forced to drop my minor in sociology as the material that I was reading in class was very, very triggering for my own PTSD that I was learning and trying to figure out how to cope with. I had to take classes incomplete. I incurred a number of expenses because I was I was taking a car instead of walking or getting on a bus. As the bananas were hung from bus stops, I had to install security cameras at my home. I had to travel to an undisclosed location, even when we filed the lawsuit, and have specifically had to decrease my social media usage. And so, to the point about the answer to hate speech is more speech, it actually is that's a faulty notion, because it assumes that more speech is actually going to be more counter speech and not more hate speech. And what I've experienced is that as a millennial, I had to completely decrease and almost halt my social media usage in the way that I communicate with my friends, the way I communicate with my family, because I am at risk for doxing continuously, because unfortunately, like other people who experience this kind of harassment, once your information is out there, it never goes away.
That is painful to hear. And I thank you, and I yield back. And now I recognize our ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And Ms. Dumpson, I too just want to say thank you for being here and sharing your story. I think it's outrageous and unacceptable that anyone would be targeted and have to endure what you have. So thanks for sharing. I was going to start with Mr. Donahue. I too want to thank you for your years of service. You and your brothers and sisters in the blue put your lives on the line every day to protect and secure our communities. We're definitely living through some troubling times. And unfortunately, we're seeing where platforms are being used today by politicians to push dangerous movements like defund the police. City councils are trying to dismantle local police forces, and individuals use social media to intentionally put officers' lives on the lines. Mr. Donahue, do you have a message for platforms like Twitter about the real-world implications of what is happening on their platform?
Absolutely. Thank you, Congressmember Rogers. And I have colleagues from around the country, from Boston and Pennsylvania to Texas, that are feeling the strain of what is being played out on social media towards policing and towards the right approach to trying to protect civil society. Platforms such as Twitter and Facebook and others are propagating all of those anti-police, anti-government messages. They're the same platforms that delivered horrendous content to Ms. Dumpson. And the challenges that we face at a tactical level to platforms like Twitter and Facebook is that they're incredibly difficult to deal with from a law enforcement perspective. And to amplify what Mr. Kendall had said, it is true that they're more concerned about privacy because that's where the pushback has come. But the anonymity that is also ripe on those platforms make it equally more difficult to try and protect people like Ms. Dumpson and police officers that are in the line of fire, literally, at violent protests around the country.
Thank you. Ambassador Ginsburg, in your written statement, you discussed Telegram and how it was used by Antifa and other groups to recruit individuals in Portland, Oregon to engage in violent protests against police. Can you explain what you saw there and whether you believe app stores should do more to vet apps being used for nefarious purposes? He's muted, I think. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you.
Try again. Yeah, thank you.
We issued 3 reports in the last 2 months about how Telegram was utilized by both anarchists and white nationalist groups to not only target police, but also to instigate violence against protesters on the other side, and to not only instigate and incite, but we saw that Telegram and communications were actually directing where rioters should go to the least protected police sites or where police were located. And so what we really saw here is how Telegram has become, in effect, probably the worst mobile application in both the Google and Apple Store that is serving as in effect, a major conveyor of radicalization, and most importantly, a very dangerous app that has been hijacked by everybody who is sending QAnon Q drops to QAnon supporters to direct individuals and rioters to attack authorities, and most importantly, to radicalize and to let German and Russian government trolls and German neo-Nazi groups to push even more radical content across the Atlantic into Telegram accounts in the United States, of which there are over 200 million worldwide. So
okay,
you can just
thank
imagine.
you. Thank you. Yep, very good. Thank you. Finally, Mr. Donahue, you were also in your written statement, you talked about the surge in anti-police, anarchist messaging on the far left of social media and the memes and hashtags that are advocating the murder of law enforcement. Can you explain how social media platforms and Twitter have played a role in the nationwide coordinated violence that we've seen recently?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we've seen more recently is the emergence of certain code words, things that in my 32 years of policing I had not heard before. And I'll reference them. It's ACAB or F12. These are terms that never existed. I'd never seen it anywhere. And in the months after the murder of George Floyd, in the short months after that, the type of vitriol directed at police directly as a consequence of that, and demanding the murder of police officers on Twitter and Facebook, and those memes and slogans shot up 300 to 1,000%. And these are things that have never been seen before. So that's how the type of activity that we're talking about and the consequences on police who are literally trying to protect peaceful protesters have turned violent against us.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you for the extra time.
Yeah. Let me, now, can you hear me? Am I on mute? I'm good. Okay. And now I'm going to call on Kathy Castor for 5 minutes. It looks like Frank Pallone is not here, our ranking member. So Ms. Castor, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Schakowsky. Thanks to all of our witnesses. Ms. Dumpson, you are courageous. Thank you for sharing your story and working so that others don't have to experience the hate and harassment that you've lived through. Mr. Donahue, my heart goes out to our public safety officers who are being targeted. It's outrageous, and we've got to make all of this stop. You know, this subcommittee has held a number of important hearings on the ways social media companies and online platforms are harming consumers and society. But I think this hearing today might be the most important. The online surveillance of individuals through online platforms has evolved now into dangerous manipulation. The surveillance and manipulation goes on without permission and knowledge of individuals, and even worse, online platforms like Facebook and YouTube make billions of dollars as this goes on with this stomach-churning stew of illegal activity like the sale of opioids, child sex trafficking, fomenting of violence, online abuse. So the witnesses today have testified about how social media companies and online platforms are amplifying the extremist views and radicalizing people across America and across the planet. This manipulation is having real-world consequences. And I'm especially worried about children. Our children are being surveilled. They're being exposed to extremist content and manipulated. And the long-term consequences are very serious. So I've introduced the Kids Internet Design and Safety Act, or KIDS Act, along with Vice Chair Clark and Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton. It's similar to Senator Markey's bill in the Senate. It would make it unlawful for platforms directed to children to amplify, promote, or encourage extremist views or fail to implement a mechanism for users to report suspected violations. So Congress needs to act. I'm going to look forward to Chair Schakowsky's draft bill because I'm eager to act here. Mr. Ginsburg, how are online platforms promoting extremist messaging to children, and what are the best steps that parents can take right now to protect their kids?
Thank you, Madam Congresswoman, for the question. I go back to the example of YouTube and how young teenagers are being lured onto video games that, which of course is something that young children and young adults like to use, that in effect bait them into from shooting at Israeli soldiers wearing Jewish Stars of David by Nazi soldiers. When they log on to those accounts, you have to understand the fungibility of looking at YouTube and Facebook and Twitter as one big social media platform, because we tend to make a mistake of segregating these systems. But when, in the end, one radical account on Facebook all of a sudden lures a young kid from YouTube onto Facebook and onto Twitter. And that's part of the problem with all of their ridiculously different terms of service. Number two, the other thing that we've seen is TikTok, and that hasn't been mentioned here. TikTok has used the parody of a Bruno Mars song, Locked Out of Heaven, to parody the Holocaust. Now, there were young kids dressed up in concentration camp garb on this TikTok video, tweens, who had no idea, of course, that what they were doing or appearing to be doing. And the fact that TikTok permitted this to happen, it's not the first time. This is an example of where, now that TikTok has become such a major issue here in the United States, the idea that a video like that would be permitted to be having young kids participate in it as a parody of the Holocaust, well, it speaks for itself.
Yeah, that's sick. I mean, that's just plain sick. So it seems like Section 230 is an impediment to protecting our kids. What's your view?
Absolutely. Section 230 is the holy grail for social media companies. And we long have advocated that the partisan divide about Section 230 needs to come to terms with the fact that as long as 230 is on the books, social media companies will only have a moral and not a legal or financial responsibility to protect our young people as well as Americans.
And to close, Mr. Kendall, I watched The Social Dilemma last night, and I heard you loud and clear that you don't let your kids onto social media at all. And I recommend all of you, while you're staying safe at home, to watch this Netflix, The Social Dilemma. It's quite illuminating. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I would second that advice, The Social Dilemma. And let me now recognize Congressman Bouchon for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And, you know, it's pretty clear to me that Ms. Dumpson's story alone should be enough to convince the U.S. Congress to address this issue. Social media sites are no longer just platforms innocently posting content, and we need to reconsider whether or not they're more traditional news outlets. And governments around the world are going to have to address this and have an honest discussion here in the U.S. about Section 230. Mr. Donahue, I appreciate the difficult line that law enforcement must walk in protecting the public, and in that regard, putting themselves in harm's way. It's a tough job, so I worry about the impediments that stand in the way of those duties. For this reason, I was especially stunned by the reference in your testimony that since 2016, Twitter specifically has intentionally ended sharing information with law enforcement, potentially life-saving information. Since Jack Dorsey hasn't taken us up on our request to testify this year, can you tell me why Twitter stopped sharing information with law enforcement?
Absolutely. And I was part of the New York City Police Department's Intelligence Bureau at the time that decision was made. And it put police agencies around the country in the dark as to certain information that's collected by Twitter, specifically by Twitter, and was available to third-party providers of information that anyone, marketing companies, people that are amplifying messages to target you for, what type of soap you should buy or what type of razors you should use. But they intentionally changed their terms of service so that that type of information, publicly available to anyone else, would no longer be available to law enforcement. And they did that at the request of the American Civil Liberties Union. It's the question, it keeps going back to the question of privacy. There are ways to protect people's privacy without hamstringing law enforcement. I would just like to add one more thing, Congressmember, is that it is very difficult for law enforcement to get in touch with social media companies who have on their sites concerning life-threatening information that could be acted on to save people's lives or prevent catastrophe. And that needs to change.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't quite understand why, if, regular citizens know information that could lead directly to harm or death to other citizens, or that, we are basically compelled by law in many ways to address that. I was a physician before, and so, I understand this concept and present these things. If, for example, if someone is brought to the hospital who's a risk to themselves or others, we're bound to report that, and that person needs legally adjudicated. But why social media companies that have information that could be harmful to others, don't feel if that's the case? I do think we can balance civil liberty concerns and the need to protect the public, don't you?
Absolutely. There are, and I take to heart that you were a physician, because then you understand the importance of HIPAA protections on privacy, on people's health records and privacy. And there are schemes that people have, legislative schemes, regulatory schemes that people have envisioned that would mirror HIPAA as a framework for how this type of information, human behavioral data, might be protected from the social media companies themselves. And there are people that are far better off talking about that than me, but I've seen those potential opportunities. And we know that HIPAA works. And there has got to be a way to find the way to break that sharing of very valuable human behavioral data that then forces certain information to people's cell phones, to their smartphones, that enables them to act.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more. I also would want to associate myself with Kathy McMorris-Rogers' opening statement as regards to bias. I think even though we may identify bias that today appears to be mostly against the president of the Republican Party, tomorrow it may be against the Democrat president of the United States. And it was, in fact, when President Obama was president. This is not a partisan issue. We need to address it. And I look forward to Congress further discussing it. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Robin Kelly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this very timely hearing on social media and the spread of extremist content. I want to thank my Greek sister for coming forward. Thank you so much. Thank you for your strength. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for teaching us. I know it's not an easy thing to do, but thank you. And to Mr. Donahue, I have 5 family members that are or were NYPD. So just had to say hi to you.
Oh, very good. Thank you.
We're really concerned about, with elections around the corner, what's happening, and we know we need to pay very close attention to what's shared online. Mr. Kendall, you were Facebook's director of monetization for approximately 5 years, and you were instrumental in developing their advertising business. During your discussions at Facebook to monetize the product, I assume there was a close connection between monetization and engagement. How much did increasing engagement drive decision-making at Facebook?
engagement drove everything at Facebook, and I assume, I'm not there, I haven't been there for 10 years, I assume it continues to drive everything today. We initially used engagement as sort of a proxy for user benefit. It seemed to be this indicator that users liked what they were seeing. But we started to realize that engagement could also mean that they were sufficiently sucked in that they couldn't work in their own best long-term interests to get off the platform when it wasn't making them feel good, or when they felt like they were getting cornered by various messages or sucked into groups whose beliefs didn't necessarily align with their own. So we started to see real life consequences, but they just weren't given much weight. Engagement always won. It always trumped.
Okay. Most of the mainstream platforms say they are doing a lot to combat extremist content, hate speech, and the like, but it's clearly not enough. From the story we heard today, is there any incentive for Facebook and other social media companies to stop or try to prevent harmful content like conspiracy theories or extremist ideologies?
I mean, there's not only there's no incentive to stop, and there's an incredible incentive to keep going and get better. Right? In my opening statement, I talked about ammonia. They're incentivized to go find the next ingredient that will be all the more powerful. And I just don't believe that's going to change unless there are financial or civil or criminal penalties associated with the harm that they create. I think without enforcement, they're just going to continue to be embarrassed by the mistakes, and they'll talk about empty platitudes about, gee, we hope we can get better operationally next time. But I don't believe anything systemic will change.
So you don't believe social media companies are capable of changing their own behaviors based on current law?
No, I just think the incentives to govern, I think the incentives to keep going, to keep the status quo are just too lucrative at the moment.
So there's no moral consciousness, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that. I mean, I think the objective is to create value for shareholders, which is about giving, driving revenue, driving profits. And that's just a function of how much time people spend on the service. And people spend more time, the more we make them angry, the more we enrage them, the more we addict them.
Okay. Mr. Ginsburg, in your testimony, you documented multiple instances of disturbing content being spread on social media platforms. How do you believe social media companies should treat content that's going viral? Should a human review content if it reaches a certain threshold? Will AI magically solve these content modernization issues?
Thank you. As I pointed out in our testimony, what is the problem, for example, with Facebook is that its amplification algorithm is totally inconsistent with its efforts to, in effect, deplatform radical content. And worse, it's even unable to identify the toxic content that comes across accounts in other languages. And we can't even understand that, because with all their technicians, you would think that they understand that radical content is coming across their platforms in Arabic or Russian or German, etc. And one of the things, if I may add, the advertising industry has a responsibility here. It is the revenue leverage that is the only leverage, is the only financial leverage on social media platforms. And I really hope the committee in the future will bring in representatives of the advertising industry, which form the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, to in effect try to force social media companies to be held to account. But they're both fungible. They all need each other. But the fact remains is that the ad agency can help more to do here than what they're doing right now.
Thank you. My time is up. I yield back.
Now happy to recognize my friend, Buddy Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here and for participating in what is truly an extremely important subject matter. And you know, this is bipartisan. This should concern all of us, and I think it does concern all of us. Let me begin by saying that social media companies have moved to more aggressively moderate and police the content on their platforms, but the approaches vary significantly. While some of the efforts are able to go after accounts and posts that clearly violate their terms, they also ignore or refuse to take down other content. For example, Twitter refused earlier this year to remove a tweet by Iran's supreme leader, which called for the destruction and genocide of the Israeli people. Twitter responded that these tweets were not in violation of their policies. I want to start with you, Mr. Donahue, and ask you, can you explain to me as best you can how some platforms maintain policies that are inconsistent and create more problems?
So, while I am not a coder, I understand what is being published online in those forums. Their content and their individual corporate terms of service, which people who post on it are free to do so and accept those terms of service. But they vary based on both the platform, the jurisdiction where they are incorporated, and what's supposed to be driving their profit motives. And I listened to Ambassador Ginsburg and Mr. Kendall very clearly that it's the profit motive that drives it. And when you look at hyperbolic statements like the one you just spoke about, and yet having a response, I take it at its face value that they said, no, that doesn't violate our terms of service and our posting. That's a real concern. And we've seen it with respect to things that are happening here in the U.S. And I could expand upon that with regard to extremist, disturbing content about advocating the murder of police officers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Donahue. Mr. Ginsburg, let me ask you, anti-Semitism is a problem that continues to show its head. It's more than a problem. It's awful, and it's something we need to eliminate. How can these anti-Semitic posts be rationalized as not being in violation of Twitter's rules? I don't get it. Can you explain that to me?
They make it up as they go along, Congressman. I mean, depending on the prevailing winds and the amount of pressure on them, most of what we see in terms of, for example, anti-Semitism right now is emerging from QAnon accounts, which itself has a major component of anti-Semitism in it. And the real problem here is that each of these companies have their own terms of service, and they decipher them and interpret them as they want, which is one of the reasons why I said in my testimony, we're calling for the creation of a social media standards board that would create a harmonized code of conduct across the industry that was modeled after the 1970s Financial Accounting Service Board that harmonized all of the different standards that the banking industry had.
Let me ask you something. I'll start with you, Mr. Donahue, but I'd also like Mr. Ginsburg to respond to this. Is there any telltale characteristics that of users that can help to identify some of these things, some of these posts? Are there any consistencies there?
So one of the things that's really complicated, and we've seen this in some of the work that I did with the Network Contagion Research Institute, is that it's the context in which things are said, and that really requires talented analysts. In my prepared testimony, it's the idea that while concerning content can be somewhat understood by some of the technologies that the companies have put in place, it also requires eyes on, and that's why the coded messages, a very disturbing message that was posted on December 20th, 2014, before the assassination of 2 New York City police officers, was a text that was a social media post by the assassin that said, "Let's go put some wings on pigs." And that wasn't picked up because it wasn't contextualized beforehand. So it's the idea that people have to put eyes on it to understand what it means.
Mr. Ginsburg?
I just want to add very quickly, Congressman, that one of the things that we see in the spread of anti-Semitism on social media is the enormous role that fringe, deep and dark web chat rooms and messaging boards play in promoting anti-Semitism onto major social media platforms. I don't know if you're familiar with Gab or 8KUN or the other fringe boards that have become safe havens for white nationalist neo-Nazi groups, which of course are not the attention of this hearing, but I want to assure you are just as responsible for the spread of anti-Semitism into our mainstream discourse than anything else.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for your participation. I yield back.
And now it is my pleasure to recognize Mr. O'Halloran for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member. I appreciate the being able to host this committee today for you. Social media sites have proven ripe for disinformation and extremist content. Social media sites, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, have responded differently to extremist content on their platforms in attempting to moderate the most vile content. However, these efforts remain disjointed and frankly insufficient. What has resulted has been a dramatic increase in the usage of social media by extremists over the past 15 years. These failures do not just result in isolated incidents either, and domestic law enforcement agencies are paying attention. In May 2019, the FBI's Assistant Director of their Counterterrorism Division, Michael McGarity, noted in testimony to the House Homeland Security Committee, radicalization to violence of domestic terrorists is increasingly taking place online, where violent extremists can use social media for the distribution of propaganda, recruitment, target selections, and incentivize to violence. Through the internet, violent extremists around the world have access to our local communities to target and recruit and spread their messages of hate on a global scale, as we saw in the recent attack in New Zealand. Social media has provided these individuals with a platform like no other, and other like-minded individuals to virtually congregate and the results in similar-minded attacks. More needs to be done, and additional government coordination with the social media sites is necessary to prevent the spread of extremist content. We also need to discuss the role that fringe social media sites play in spreading the extremist content. Sites like 8chan have spawned domestic terrorists, and those sites lack even the basic interest in content moderation. Real attacks that have resulted in the loss of life have occurred, and no tangible progress has been made in stopping this. Mr. Donahue, I have a question for you. Thank you for, first of all, joining us today. And can you speak to, based on your experience as a former New York City police chief, how the communication between federal agencies and local police departments can be improved to better respond to the threat that extremist actors pose to civil society?
Thank you very much, Congressmember. You raised Mike McGarity's name in his testimony last year. As a matter of fact, the New York City Police Department assembled a religious and ethnically motivated violent extremist investigative squad as a consequence of what the FBI had been seeing, and are actively investigating occurrences of that type of activity in the New York region. But what is significantly lacking is that ability to create for smaller jurisdictions, smaller municipalities, and less well-funded jurisdictions, the ability to reach out when an issue occurs, or when these types of concerns, of the strategic concerns that I spoke about earlier, come to the fore. Because smaller jurisdictions, there's 18,000 local and state county police departments around the United States. They're not a monolith, and they certainly don't have individualized capacities to do it. They need to leverage fusion centers to be able to get information from the social media companies, as well as being able to further disseminate that information both up and down the chain from the federal authorities and from the localities. There are structures in place to make sure that civil liberties are protected. And I believe that we have a lot of energy in that direction to be able to strengthen those relationships. However, the social media companies need to be willing partners, or there has to be a cudgel used to bring them to the table.
And Madam Chair, I see my time is short, so I will yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And now I recognize Congresswoman Blunt Rochester for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I want to especially thank the witnesses today for this very important hearing, and especially Taylor Dumpson. Taylor, your courage to stand up against hate groups like the Daily Stormer and racist bullies inspires each of us to do more. And your work to shine a light on these issues is so important now more than ever. One of the things that you said is that hate should not be normalized. And that is one of the big messages that I'm going to take away from this hearing. And I wanted to ask you, I know 5 minutes was not a lot of time, but if there was anything else that you wanted to share with us as members of the subcommittee that you didn't get a chance to say in that 5-minute opening. Any advice to us?
Thank you. One of the things I wanted to bring to your all's attention is that from the very first moment that I became a hate crime survivor, I've been fighting back against this through almost every free moment between going to school, spending time with my family and friends. But I've been sharing my story with students, with academics, religious communities, legal professionals, and elected officials to really get at the changing the hearts and minds and also changing the law. But every hate crime survivor shouldn't be expected to respond and react the way that I have. Unfortunately, when the hate crime happened on May 1st, it received national media attention, which meant that cameras were in my face less than 3 days after the initial event. So I didn't really have much of a choice to step into this role. But since I'm here, I'm dedicated to using my platform to bring these issues to attentions of Congress members. So for that, I want to kind of pivot to how Congress can act in this space. Congress can do 3 things immediately to address the rise of online extremism and hate. Which is to first increase hate crime reporting and data collection by incentivizing and encouraging state and local law enforcement agencies to more comprehensively collect and report on hate crimes to the FBI, as well as increasing their trauma-informed preparedness, because I know that in the times where I've reported my instances of hate and harassment to law enforcement officers, they have not been trauma-informed, they have not always responded to me, and they've not always been technologically competent to be able to address and act on the harms and threats that I've received. The second thing is to hold perpetrators accountable and to better support survivors by enacting federal doxing and swatting legislation and strengthening protections for victims and targets of hate crime and cyber harassment. I was able to sue 3 individuals and 1 corporation, but I was not able to sue the thousands of people that have continued to harass me to this day. And then the third thing is to compel social media companies to be accountable and to be transparent by supporting research and enacting legislation so that people like me don't have to experience hate crimes in person or digitally on a daily basis. And it's clear that the hate and social media, it's clear that tech companies are not doing themselves accountable. And so it really is up to Congress to act here.
Thank you so much, Taylor. And then I wanted to ask, and I will submit some questions for the record for some of the other witnesses because of time, but I was able to send a letter with members of our committee as well as other members to Facebook regarding civil rights and the actions that they're going to take. We received a lackluster response. I would love to know from Ambassador Ginsburg as well as Mr. Kendall if there are examples of platforms that have taken good steps to address extremism, and if so, who are they?
Well, each one of these platforms will be able to have demonstrated a certain amount of progress, and they try to tout that in every testimony that they produce before the Congress. But the problem is that they're doing it at their own speed, and to say that one platform is doing worse than the other or better than the other is to, in effect, belie the fact that all of them are creating the same mess and compounding it even more so, with the support of these fringe platforms and with the support of other internet techniques and technical platforms like Telegram. So I would say that, for example, that Facebook could be doing a much better job if it, in effect, joined other organizations in supporting a more comprehensive, harmonized code of conduct, and in effect said, we will not let Telegram be dictating to us what radical content should come on our platform. They're not doing enough of that at all.
In the last 20 seconds, Mr. Kendall, can you just hit on, I know you've talked about the monetization, I know you've talked about the algorithms, anything that you want to share in the last 15 seconds?
Well, I just think the current policies are incomplete, and they're incomplete everywhere because the incentives aren't there to put in place good policies. So obviously, you can't incite violence, but you can lie and incite hate. And we all know that leads to violence. But there's no accountability.
Thank you all so much for your testimony, and we will be submitting additional questions for the record. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back, and going to the next member of the subcommittee, I recognize Darren Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. According to a 2018 MIT study, a false story reaches 1,500 people 6 times quicker on average than a true story does. And while false stories outperform the truth on every subject, including business, terrorism, and war, science and technology, and entertainment, fake news about politics regularly does best. The rapid distribution of lies and hate in social media threatens the foundation of our republic. Foreign nations are intruding in our elections, in commerce, and in our lives. Impressionable members of our population are being radicalized, then sorted into massive national political extremist networks, and lives are being destroyed. Members, we are the lawmakers. We have the duty to protect the American public online, and we have the power to do so. This subcommittee specifically is charged with the duty and power to reform. We simply need the will to act. And make no mistake about it, members, social media extremism and criminality is not invincible, it is not unstoppable, and it is not unsolvable. We can establish social media platform liability to compensate victims and force changes in business behaviors. And we could regulate algorithms to stop proliferation of false and violent information. The fact that these companies are no longer nation startups just beginning to develop these technologies is important. They are now a mature industry, the social media industry. Its companies are found among the ranks of Fortune 500 companies, even Fortune 100 companies. Mr. Kendall, we can simply make social media companies liable for damages in court for criminal activity perpetrated on their platform. Do you think this would be a sufficient and costly enough incentive for social media companies to more actively police their networks for criminality?
I do. I think that all we can do is sort of look at precedent and look at what's happened, particularly with Facebook historically, which is that the threats around privacy and they're getting their act together around user information didn't do anything. And it wasn't until 2019 when there was a $5 billion fine and then ongoing structural penalties put in place for violations that they cleaned it all up. And we haven't heard anything about it since.
Thanks, Mr. Kendall. I agree. Right now, these costs are externalized to society. We need to internalize them to the companies themselves because right now they're not internalizing them. Ms. Thompson, I'm so sorry to hear about what happened to you. We appreciate your courage in telling your very personal story. Do you think that social media networks were at all culpable in the perpetration of hate crimes against you?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. Yes, I do. And that's because the social media companies, while they've continued to say that they're working on these issues, they've never responded or addressed these issues. One example is just like 3 days ago on YouTube, somebody commented underneath of an interview that I did about a year ago. There are about 2 million views on that video, and it's on YouTube, but there are 13,000 comments. One of the comments was, she probably tied those bananas from nooses herself, as if to suggest that I was behind the hate crime that was enacted on May 1st, when there's video footage there. The harassment that I continue to receive from these platforms has not been taken down, despite my efforts, my friends' efforts, my family members' efforts to report these things continuously. Some of the harassment's also more threatening, like statements, and I quote, "I wonder what color the blood looks like. I think I'd punch her in the face and take a battery charge for 3 years." And people have even gone so far as to place threatening calls over the phone. And so it seems to me as though there's no limit, or no stopping how far extremists are willing to go to spread their message and to target survivors and victims.
Thank you, Ms. Dumpson. Mr. Ginsburg, how do we regulate to adjust algorithms to limit the proliferation of false information? What would be your recommendation?
My recommendation is that there's software technology that it was developed, including by our own Vice President, Eric Feinberg, that has the ability to machine learn and teach algorithms to identify extremist content. If I told you that Facebook's algorithms are untrained to identify radical content, for example, in different languages, and yet there's third-party technology out there that could help teach those algorithms to do so, you would naturally ask, why wouldn't Facebook want to acquire that technology, correct?
Absolutely. So the technology does exist. We just merely need to require them to internalize those costs through laws. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and now I am happy to call on Doris Matsui for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing here today. The discussion has been sobering and important, and this topic cannot be more topical or pressing. When you think about everything else that's happening, with over 200,000 dead from COVID-19 and Americans taking to the streets to demand justice and equity, opportunities for extremist content online to undercut our efforts are significant. We need to take action. I appreciate all of you for being here, and particularly Ms. Dumpson. You're very brave, and I think any one of us could be subjected to the hate that you have been subjected to in a manner, in a different, separate manner perhaps, but to have that constantly on your mind and surrounding you, that is something that we have to address. You have to monitor this all the time. It is part of your life. And I have to say that it is something that I don't think any one of us would wish on anybody at all, even the person that we don't like the most. But you were talking about before the correlation of the vitriol in posts targeting you and the amount of times they're shared or viewed, which means that as they continue and people like them and they continue sharing them, they're out there. And as you said before, you can't pull them back at all. So for you, do you see that constantly continuing now, in the sense that even though you have done everything you possibly can, it is still out there?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And yes, every time that I do events like this, whether I'm speaking to students, whether I'm speaking on a panel, whether I'm speaking to Congress, anytime my name is put out there, it's synonymous with hate crimes. It's synonymous with the Daily Stormer. But then that provokes these online trolls to go out of their way to find me. So I've been personally monitoring one particular interview that I did with CNN in September of last year, and I've been monitoring it over the past year, and I've seen a number of trends within the just one comment thread alone. That post was not just posted on YouTube, it's also been posted on Twitter, it's also been posted on Facebook. And so I don't have the I don't have the capacity to go and find all of the different things with my name in it. It's impossible. And it's also very triggering for PTSD and depression and anxiety to read the threats that are directed at you every day. And so my mom and my dad try and get me not to read it. But it's very important for me. It's very important for me to see it, though, because unfortunately, because there are not protections in place at this current time, I don't have anybody else that's responsible for doing that. And so I'm going to be out here in the world going blind if I'm not going out of my way to monitor and make sure that I'm on top of my safety. But that responsibility shouldn't rest on me.
Absolutely. You know, as we discussed, while Facebook the company may remove a post for violence, these posts can be copied, as happened with you, and shared through alternative channels. Mr. Kendall, in your opinion, why have social media companies struggled to address this phenomena? And are they devoting sufficient resources to tackling this problem? They say they have, but what can we do to really encourage them to do so?
Well, I don't think they're doing enough. And as I said earlier, I think it's really just a function of incentives. Their incentives are to grow revenue and maximize profit, because that keeps the valuation of their company high, that keeps their employees happy and retained, and it allows them to continue to dominate as a platform. So I just don't think the incentives are there. I think the capability is there. And we've seen that in their compliance with privacy. And I saw that when I was there in terms of their ability to marshal resources and technology know-how to solve really tough problems that were seemingly intractable, that then they were able to solve.
So you're basically, privacy comes up an awful lot here. We always believe in our own privacy and how important that is. But to me, from the discussion here, that privacy has come up an awful lot as the way to get into this, as the cudgel, so to speak, to really alert them that we are looking at this in a way that would affect them most importantly where their bottom line is. So is that something that all you would agree to as far as trying to tackle this? Mr. Ginsburg?
Yeah, well, I would like to just point out what European countries have done. There's such a transatlantic divide between us struggling here what to do with social media companies. And when you send an executive from Facebook or YouTube across the pond, they are actually facing a totally different, much more strict regimental of laws that would hold them both also criminally liable for failing to take down the content within a certain period of time. I know that these laws obviously can't be replicated here, but the subcommittee would benefit, I think, from understanding how many different national laws have been adopted to deal with these privacy issues. France, for example, is just about to pass a new hate law to, in effect, punish social media for doing precisely the type of activity that is so unfortunately affecting Ms. Thompson.
Well, thank you very much. We can go on and on with this conversation. Madam Chair, thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and now I'm recognizing member of the subcommittee, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairwoman, and I thank the witnesses. Very a tough testimony, very interesting and useful. And it seems to me that this is a bipartisan issue. Both sides want to move forward on this, so I look forward to seeing progress. My first comments are directed at Mr. Kendall. Last year, I sent a letter to Mr. Zuckerberg expressing my concerns about the conflict of interest at Facebook between their bottom line and addressing the spread of political disinformation. I asked a series of questions at the hearing about their content moderation practices and handling of disinformation. This includes the process of using third-party fact checkers, something the company often points to because they don't want to be, quote, arbitrators of truth. One of the questions I asked in the letter and Facebook failed to answer, and then I asked again when they testified and they still failed to answer, was about the average time it takes from when a suspicious content is posted on Facebook's platform, for Facebook to flag the content for the third-party fact checkers, for the third-party fact checkers to review the content, and for Facebook to take remedial action after review is completed. Despite Facebook's failure to answer congressional inquiries, a journalist discovered that in the entire month of January, only 300 pieces of Facebook content in the United States underwent third-party fact checking. And that most of the content undergoing this process had been posted on Facebook's platform for a week or longer. Mr. Kendall, once content is posted on Facebook, what is the time frame during which most of the sharing, consumption, and monetization occurs?
Congressman, thanks for the question. I don't have the expertise to answer that question.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I have seen graphs around this, in my career, and certainly when something is time relevant and incendiary, it spreads very quickly, very fast, and it generates a tremendous amount of engagement. And so I would say with time-sensitive incendiary content, you make a disproportionate amount of the money in the first 24 hours, possibly even the first hour.
Correct. That's exactly my understanding. Would you agree that a company relying on content review process that isn't like this one, isn't prioritizing addressing the spread of disinformation on its platform, and that doesn't have a real incentive to do so?
I would agree.
Thank you. The American public does deserve more than a press release every time a social media company announces that they have taken down a fake account. Sorry? I have to start that sentence over again. The American public deserves more than a press release every time a social media company announces that they have taken down a fake account, or when they're looking into making a minor change around the edges, which is what they usually do. With 40 days to go until the election, and with early voting in mail already getting underway, I am extremely concerned that these companies aren't doing enough. Mr. Kendall, what meaningful steps should social media companies be taking right now to combat the spread of social political disinformation on their platforms?
Well, it's hard for me to know exactly how the resources are allocated. I haven't been there for 10 years, but it seems to me that the same amount of resources that they have applied to driving this sort of unprecedented engagement, both in terms of the technology and financial resources, but also the people, should be applied to these systemic and societal problems.
They have the resources. There's no question in my mind about that. To Mr. Ginsburg, President Trump has repeatedly retweeted posts by alt-right programmers and promoters and conspiracy theorists. The President of the United States has even gone on to quote fascists like Mussolini. What are the consequences when the government is calling a group a terrorist organization in one breath and the President is supporting their idea in another?
It's very dangerous. I can refer directly to the QAnon phenomenon, where there's hundreds of thousands of accounts that have crossed the pond and have then ricocheted back with even more radical content. And obviously the president is a central player in this QAnon phenomenon. So he, in effect, has become the hero among the most virulent neo-Nazi Germans as the new leader of this QAnon initiative to defund the state in Germany. Could you be as any surprised as I am that Mr. Trump is a hero in Germany to the largest neo-Nazi group in Europe?
Thank you. I yield back.
And I now recognize Congresswoman Nigel, who I know was here at the beginning, and I'm glad to see that you're here now for your 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing, which is really critical, and thank you to all of the witnesses that are here today. During this pandemic, we all are feeling more isolated than ever, which has left more people turning to the internet and social media in search of community. I have great concern that the pandemic and the isolation caused by it will exacerbate this issue that we're talking about today. I'm really concerned about how this country is being divided by fear and hatred and how it is threatening the safety and security of the individuals, as we've seen in Ms. Dumpson's testimony, but I've seen with other people that I know in my very own community, which I'll talk to hopefully before I end. Extremist groups recruit and radicalize individuals by finding people who are socially isolated and give them a sense of belonging. And now, due to the necessary measures to combat COVID-19, people find themselves like they have nobody to talk to or connect to, which is putting the greater risk of being brought in by these extremist groups. So it's crucial that we examine the impact that COVID-19 has had on the proliferation of extremist content and the measures we need to take to combat radicalization, division, and hate. This is of critical importance. I think I'm going to move directly, given time, to something that impacts my own community, which is home to one of the largest Arab American populations in the country. It's well documented that militia and extremist groups have used platforms such as Facebook to organize events, often including a call to arms designed to intimidate specific communities, such as the Muslim and Arab communities, and incite violence. I, quite frankly, have had people outside my home with assault weapons, myself. So I really know firsthand. I probably shouldn't have said that publicly because I don't want to see more of them. In many of these instances, pages and events are reported to Facebook, but the companies don't give a damn. They show a pattern of negligence in responding to or removing the content that promotes violence against vulnerable communities. In July 2020, Relman Colfax released their civil rights audit report of Facebook's policies and practices. The report detailed the need for further investment in addressing and studying organized hate against Muslims and other targeted groups on the platform. These findings represent a clear and present danger to these groups, and inaction continues to contribute to the violence being perpetuated against these communities in the United States and abroad. Mr. Kendall, I listened to the testimony and the many thoughtful questions and answers today. There's a lot of ideas out there. We talked about changing incentives, but what else can be done to hold companies accountable when these communities are targeted on the platforms?
Well, I think at the moment, from a policy standpoint, the only thing that is, at least by virtue of the policy, that leads to a takedown of content is when violence is incited. But as I mentioned earlier, if you incite hate and rage or demonize that group, that doesn't get taken down. But we all know that that kind of content leads to violence. It's just not directly connected to the platform, right? Because the violence wasn't planned on the platform, at least not explicitly. And so I think that we've got to get clear on some sort of gradient around hate speech, even when it doesn't incite violence explicitly, because we all know it leads to it. And so I think lawmakers need to ideally work with the companies to figure out, from a gradient standpoint, what is the line at which an opinion becomes hate speech? And when that line gets crossed, I think the content needs to either be flagged or taken down.
So, Madam Chairwoman, I do want to request unanimous consent to submit for the record the civil rights audit report conducted by Relman Colfax and the press release by Muslim advocates detailing multiple cases where Facebook was warned of the hateful content and failed to take direct action. I have very little time left, Mr. Kendall, but what's violence? Being outside somebody's home with an assault weapon? Violence? Or is that hate? Or is that fear? How do we protect free speech but keep somebody safe? How do we actually have or shape these standards? I think it's something we've got to do. We really need to be worried about what's happening in this country.
I think you got to start somewhere. I think you could start by doing it in the first place. I think that there were probably similar challenges with pornography, and similar challenges with nudity on certain platforms where that's not a legality issue, but these platforms are somehow able to keep all nudity off. Now that's a little bit more objective. But pornography, as an instance, is much more subjective and much more nuanced and gray. But we tackled that challenge, and we now have technologies in place that help us with that. And I just feel like there's got to be a way to do that with respect to hate language.
I agree. Thank you, Madam.
And as for your request, your documents will be added at the end of the hearing. And I see that the chairman of the full committee, Frank Pallone, is here. And I'm happy to recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Schakowsky. I was down on the floor dealing with the energy package. I did want to comment, though, on what the ranking member, Mr. Walden, said about police ambush attacks. I thought he implied that these should be attributed to left-wing extremists, but unfortunately, police are targeted by extremists of all sorts. In fact, 2 recent ambush-style attacks perpetrated by right-wing extremists were motivated by the Boogaloo movement's ideology. So I hope that this hearing addresses extremism without partisan finger-pointing, because I think it comes from both the left and the right. I wanted to start with Ambassador Ginsburg. We all know the platform's shared talking points. Hate speech has no place on our platform. Violence and extremism are not tolerated here. There's no safe haven for terrorists on our site. But far too often, that rhetoric doesn't match the reality. Hateful and violent comment is running rampant on most platforms. Early this year, it took repeated pleas to Facebook from my friend Rabbi Kotler, who's from Lakewood, and we got together with him and government officials to get a local Ocean County, New Jersey hate groups page removed. But soon after it was removed, the group started several new pages. So it's very hard to get these things changed, and I went through it myself with some of the anti-Semitic rhetoric that was on there. Ambassador Ginsburg, you've stated in the past that you often find extremist material on social media sites before the social media company itself finds it. Can you expand on that? How effective are social media platforms at dealing with extremist content, and what more could they be doing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, it really comes down to technology and what technology companies like Facebook are willing to adopt. I've explained in my prior comments that Facebook's algorithms are not able to detect extremist content, for example, that is used by extremist groups in other languages, even Yiddish. And so, for example, there's technology out there that is called machine learning technology that would train the algorithms to more expeditiously identify extremist content if Facebook would allow this third-party technology to peer into its API, which is in effect the holy grail or the cliff notes of their algorithms. And that's the problem. I have not seen any instance where Facebook or any other platform has permitted any third party to look into the underbelly of their algorithms, because I think they're afraid that we would find out that they really don't want to see a complete 100% takedown of extremist content.
So you're talking about more transparency about the algorithms, or the ability to evaluate and improve them. Is that basically what you're discussing? You want to talk a little more about that, the transparency, and how that if the researchers, experts had access, they would be able to improve them and prevent extremism?
Yes, absolutely. And I think another reason is that their legal counsel in each of these companies serve as bars to having this technology adopted, because these counsel, and I've been told this by Facebook's prior counsel, that they do not want to introduce third-party technology for fear that courts would interpret that as having these platforms accept responsibility for content, and therefore could have perhaps vitiate Section 230. So you're in a vicious circle here.
Well, let me ask you one thing. There's about a minute left. What role? Oh, actually, I wanted to ask Mr. Kendall. Mr. Kendall, if I could move to you, there's about a minute left here on my time. What about personalization? What role does personalization play in amplifying radical content?
Oh, I think it's central, Congressman. Facebook has an unrivaled ability to deliver content to the right person at the right time in the exact right way. And so right now what they've created, I'm concerned about, is 3 billion or nearly 3 billion echo chambers, individual echo chambers that just reinforce what people believe. And unfortunately, and I don't think this is with the intention by the leaders there, unfortunately, the algorithm moves people to more radical positions over time because that movement is good for business. If the content that I show you tomorrow is more incendiary, I believe you're going to spend more time on the platform, and that means that more revenue is generated.
All right, thanks a lot. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you. It looks like maybe last but not least, the people who have not spoken yet, the Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Cardenas, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you so much for having this important hearing. I have a letter in my hand that has to do with what highlights the escalation of hate on online platforms and the need for civil rights advocacy in the social media and content modernization space. I would like to submit this letter from the National Hispanic Media Coalition for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And thank you all for your testimony today, and especially Ms. Dumpson for your bravery and for sharing your personal ordeal. 2,200 ads. 2,200 is the number of ads the current president administration has run on Facebook referring to Latino immigrants as, quote, an invasion. It took 12 hours for a person to drive across the state of Texas to El Paso. The New York Times reported that 19 minutes before the first 911 call alerted the authorities to a mass shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, a hate-filled anti-immigrant manifesto appeared online. 23 people, the majority of which are Mexican Americans, died in August of 2019 due to what was referred to in the white supremacist manifesto as Hispanic invasion in Texas. This is not a one-off issue. White supremacist groups are increasing their use of social media as a tool to distribute their message of hate to a loyal and captive audience. My first question is to you, Ms. Dumpson, and once again, thank you so much for your bravery. According to the FBI annual report in 2017, hate crimes overall spiked by 17%, where more than half of the reported crimes were motivated by race. In 2018, they increased even more, reaching a 16-year high in 2018. Based on your experience, Ms. Dumpson, to what extent does inaction by social media companies contribute to the manifestation of online hate in the real world?
Thank you, Congressman. Unfortunately, silence is complicity. And when social media companies fail to act, they are complicit in the violence that's spread. They're complicit in the harm it has caused, and they perpetuate these kinds of acts in the future. Unfortunately, when these companies don't use their platforms for good, they allow these things to, like, as you said, run rampant. They allow their platforms to be utilized in this way. And so by failing to act, it leaves me to only wonder, what other intent do you have for your platform to be used? And what other way can you desire your platform to be used? But this is precisely why I shared in my testimony that I've been working with a very diverse coalition of NGOs led by the ADL, the NAACP, the Color of Change, LULAC, and others to engage these corporations and over 60 social celebrities reaching out to billions of followers through the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which has been calling on Facebook and social media companies to better address hate on their platforms. But in particular, this coalition hasn't succeeded with Facebook yet. And so I truly do think that congressional legislation action is needed.
Thank you, Ms. Dumpson. Anti-immigrant groups demonize immigrants by promoting theories and conspiracies online that paint immigrants as outsiders who are planning to invade the country and take it over. Some anti-immigrant activists, for example, have embraced the Aztlán or Reconquista conspiracy theory, the idea that Mexican immigrants are plotting to take over the southwestern part of the United States. This theory uses fear and hate to prop up claims that Mexican immigrants do not want to assimilate into American society. Ambassador Ginsburg, what is being done to mitigate hate and harassment aimed at the immigrant Latino, and communities of color on social media? And is it enough?
Clearly, Congressman, totally unenough. And we're most concerned about the role of the Russian government and extremist groups that are anti-immigrant are using subsidiaries in Eastern Europe to promote anti-immigrant accounts in the United States. And as you well know, anybody can add to a QAnon theory an anti-immigrant component. And when you add the QAnon phenomena to the extremists that are being promoted by Russian trolls to, in effect, attack immigrant groups and minority groups in the United States, it's a real toxic swamp. And I do not see anything near the velocity of takedowns by social media companies, which they're well aware of this phenomena and this danger.
Thank you, Ambassador Ginsburg. My time has expired. I yield back.
And now, after having waded through most of this hearing, and I thank you for that, I recognize Bill Johnson for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, thanks for letting me sign on to the committee hearing today. This is an important one, and Ms. Dumpson, I tell you, no one should have to go through what you've gone through, and that's what makes the topic of today's hearing so vitally important. Mr. Donahue, back in 2016, I served on the House Energy and Commerce and Judiciary Committee's Joint Encryption Working Group. One of the recurring takeaways from several meetings was the need for increased collaboration between tech companies and law enforcement, particularly local law enforcement agencies that don't really have the resources that are enjoyed by the FBI or large police departments like the New York Police Departments, which you've worked for previously. We heard that many of these smaller departments don't know who to call or what resources are available to them when they need assistance from a tech company. This is particularly concerning as the use of encryption is prevalent and the use of social media platforms by extremist groups continues to grow. So I understand at the New York Police Department, you were involved in policing strategy and intelligence as part of your responsibilities. Did your responsibilities include working with technology companies? And if so, what was your experience?
Thank you very much, Congressmember. I actually want to borrow something that Ms. Dumpson said a little bit earlier, that the police are generally not technologically savvy. And that holds true with the majority of police departments in the United States. You know, the majority of police departments in the United States have fewer than 15 police officers for their jurisdiction. That's a fact. That's 65% of the police departments of the 18,000 only have 15 officers or less. And to expect that they're all cognizant of the technology companies and the work that the technology companies do, or how to extract evidence that's in plain sight about harassment or violence, the calls to violence, is actually asking too much. Now there are.
Well, did you actually work with any technology companies in your role to try and get some of that information?
So the answer is yes. And the answer is there were varying degrees of success. And over the course of our time in dealing with the big ones, Google, Facebook, Twitter, they were relationships that were formed ad hoc. And those types of relationships can't endure over the course of time. There need to be structures in place and places where police can rely on working closely with the tech companies, because 18,000 people over the course of 365 days, the likelihood of getting the right person on the phone at the right time is almost impossible. There are, as I said a little bit earlier, there are fusion centers that help channel that information back to the companies, but there are no phone numbers, no way to get in contact with the social media companies for a smaller jurisdiction that would make it easy to engage for life safety purposes or to get evidence of the crimes that happened to Ms. Dunn.
Okay.
Or to the crimes and that's the fact.
All right. Well, let me ask you another question. And in your testimony, you stated that major law enforcement associations are working to establish a framework to improve reporting mechanisms between the public, law enforcement, and social media service providers. And that's encouraging to hear. So what suggestions do you have to those that are focused on that issue? What suggestions do you have for improving this critical relationship between tech companies and law enforcement? And is there a role for Congress to play in that? I mean, I'm not a big regulation guy. You know, I think market-driven solutions and keeping the solutions at the local level is most important. But is there something Congress should be doing?
So there's frameworks that are being worked on by the International Association of Chiefs of Police and National Fusion Center associations. Those ideas about bringing people to the table, and specifically to what you say is, how can Congress force the social media companies to the table? And I think that's essential. That's the cudgel. And whether it's a responsible framework for providing and building those channels through the fusion centers or through major organizations, they can be supported through grants to a Bureau of Justice Assistance to help improve technology assistance to law enforcement. So there are ways to help that happen, but it has to be with the social media company. They cannot walk away from their obligations because we're seeing what happens in the streets of America.
Okay, Madam Chairman, my time has expired. Thanks again for letting me up onto the committee, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for your participation. Normally we would end at this point. I just wanted to ask my ranking member, Ms. Rogers, if she would allow one more question, each of us. If I certainly want one if you can, and then adjourn so that we can make it to the vote.
That's fine.
Okay, so I wanted to ask Mr. Kendall a question. I did watch you on the social dilemma, that wonderful documentary. And one of the things that you talked about is that platforms are able to actually tweak algorithms for whatever they need. I know maybe that's the ammonia factor that you were talking about, like with the tobacco companies. And so they can manipulate those things. But what I really wanted to get to is, what are the things you're saying? I mean, I've heard apology after apology from Mr. Zuckerberg. I mean, ad nauseum. And oh, too bad about the genocide in Myanmar. We missed that. Sorry. Oops. But the kinds of things that we can do. And I want to ask you about 230, the clause that allows for protecting these media companies from any kind of liability. At least that's the way it's been interpreted. How important is it for us to change that? And I also wanted then to ask Mr. Ginsburg to respond to that. 230.
Congresswoman, thank you. I think it's critically important. I'm not exactly sure where to draw the lines, and from the standpoint that I do think Section 230 was instrumental in allowing some of these companies at the outset to innovate and create these platforms in the first place. But I do think at a certain size, these technology platforms do become media companies, and I think at that point need to be treated as such.
Thank you. And could I also hear, did he leave?
Yeah, no, I'm still
here. Oh, there you are. Okay. Yeah.
Madam Chairman, the fact is Section 230 has been, as in effect, been the beneficiary of $33 million in lobbying effort by social media companies to avoid it being amended in Congress. That would remove its liability, remove their immunity from content liability. They even went so far as shoving Section 230 onto the USMCA in order to make it more difficult for Congress to amend it. There's no doubt in my mind and in the mind of most people who have examined this that without removing the content immunity granted under Section 230. These companies will never assume the type of obligation that you, the members of Congress, need to have them assume.
I thank you for that. Is this one of the most important, or are there other, just a couple more that we should add to the list of things we should be considering?
I'd also would just make one more recommendation. In the absence of an amendment to Section 230, I do think that the Congress should consider how to encourage the advertising industry to do more, to leverage their influence, to insist that social media companies do more, because these advertising companies are interested in brand safety. Well, brand safety is going out the window the more radicalization occurs. And so they need to do more, and they need to step up.
Mr. Kendall, do you have a last advice to us too?
Well, I really like Mr. Ginsburg's point about, look, let's definitely hold the technology companies accountable, but let's also look at who's paying the technology companies, and I think they bear some responsibility. So I think the advertising industry can certainly help affect change.
All right. Well, thank you. Ms. Rogers, did you want to ask a question?
Well, given that they've called votes, I think I'm going to say thank you to all of our panelists today, our witnesses. Your perspectives were all very insightful and helpful. I think in all of this also, it underscores the importance of us as Congress taking action on privacy to really further hold companies accountable for how they are collecting data and how they're using that data and selling that data. I think that it's only been underscored during COVID that there is not trust, and it was underscored again today. There's not trust between citizens and the companies and how data is being used, and then we have all these kind of stories that are very concerning. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I want to say thanks for being here, and thank you, Chair, for your leadership on this.
Thank you so much. I too want to, just as before we adjourn, thank you. I definitely want to thank all of our witnesses. It was really, really important. This, I think, one of the most important hearings that we've had that really cries out now, I believe, for congressional action. Before closing, we have some documents that I will read into the record, and I request unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record. They include a statement by Representative Malinowski, a blog post by Neil Freed entitled, quote, time for the Section 30 pendulum to swing, unquote. A letter from CCIA and Net Choice, a letter from Julia Sanchez, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, a letter from Will Duffy, Duffel, Policy Analyst at the Cato Institute, a letter from the Humane Society Legislative Fund, a letter from, let's see, who is that? A letter from Consumer Reports, a letter from the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Facebook Civil Rights Audit Final Report, a press release from the Museum Advocates entitled, quote, Facebook ignores warning about event page abuse. And those are the documents, and without objection, so ordered. I remind members who really aren't here right now that pursuant to committee rules that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record but I do want to ask witnesses who may get those questions to answer and respond as promptly as possible. And at this point, the subcommittee is, with additional thanks though, one more time, this subcommittee is adjourned.
Thank you very much. Jeffrey.